Hi everyone, welcome to the Siege and Sandfox livestream. I'm Chris Wilson, the designer on the project, and the Thursday slot, what I tend to do is just sort of a weekly catch up of what we've been doing. At the moment, more kind of what I've been doing, but I'm hoping to branch out as time goes on and I get a bit more plugged in. Because I've kind of been off of my own little world for a while, up until 4.16's release. So if we hop over here, I thought I'd probably mention you've got this mysterious other here. Basically, long story short, there was a bit of a bug that was preventing me from doing the stuff I wanted to do with the AI. It was an issue with Blackboard things, so basically I couldn't use the Blackboard, and as any of you will know, been watching it recently, that's kind of been my focus. But the fix was included in 4.16, so I managed to merge all my stuff back in, and that's where we are now. Super quick recap on what I have been doing there. Let's just checking over here. Yeah, all looks good. I have been taking my behavior tree from this monstrosity to this much sweeter thing. And again, super quick summary of it is that before, basically, everything was based on this service that ran all the time, and it only had the concept of suspicion of everything. More accurately, I suppose, suspicion of the player, and anything else I wanted it to be suspicious of was kind of faked. I'd be like, hey, it's the player, but actually it's not. So the aims were to take it from something that was more general purpose, less polling, like polling as in the service was ticking like every half second, checking whether it needed to or not. Get rid of that, and just something that's, sort of incorporates all the things I've learnt. But the main area I've been working on is taking the service here and taking some of that logic and putting it into the AI controller. So the AI controller, I've taken it in terms of the way I think about it and its relationship with the behavior tree. I'm using it as a sort of filter. The perception comes into the AI controller, as you can see here through this this event, and then I have a set of filters, and suspicion is now one of those filters, and I use that to decide whether or not it's important for the behavior tree to know about it, and if it is, I fire it up to the tree, and then the tree makes its own decisions. So more specifically than that, if I just refresh my memory, how I've been getting this to work is right. So a lot of it has been going in the area of actually handling suspicion, as I said. So this happens here now, and I look at the perception events, and depending on if it was successfully sensed or not, basically I'm starting and stopping a repeating function on the timer to either increase the suspicion or decrease the suspicion. And crucially, again, rather than this being something where it's just a poll, so it's constantly saying you're here, you're here, you're here, I've made this event based, right? So the suspicion goes up or down, so we'll focus on up. It comes in through the view cone, which I'm sure we can cover another time. It comes in through the view cone and it goes up and up and up, but it doesn't really matter until it reaches a certain point. Now I define these points as suspicion levels. So 0 is no suspicion, 1 is low suspicion. In other words, you might investigate some sort of background thing or you might not care. And 2 is high suspicion. Usually this is like chasing down a target, which is often the player, but doesn't necessarily need to be. So what happens here is that we have the suspicion, the set value, which goes from 0 to 100. So at the moment it'd be increasing. And every time the value changes, I've made this other function here that looks at what the old suspicion was before and what the new one is, and assigns that a level based on those things that I said. So I believe, let's have a look. So there's two thresholds. So there's a low threshold, which I believe is 40, and a high, which is 70, so it's out of 100. This is kind of classic design magic numbers. They just seem right. But anyway, it checks to see if it reaches those thresholds, and if it does, you can see we set the suspicion here to 0, 1, or 2. And when that happens, if I go back to where I was, the cool thing about this compared to the way it used to work, where do I do it? I have to remind myself. Yes, right, there we go. So we end up comparing what the old level was to the new level, and only if it's changed, do we have this other event. So that's in the main event graph of the controller. And if that event happens, and obviously this only happens once, which is what you want because then you don't have to sort of have gates and flow control it anymore. When this event happens, we say, hey, the suspicion level has changed to this. And then what I'm doing here is a bit of processing where I'm like, okay, well, because obviously it could change down to 0. And in that case, I don't want to do anything here. The behavior tree does stuff, which we'll come to later, but this doesn't really do anything. So what we'll do is if it's greater than 0, in other words, for our purposes, it's 1 or 2, then what happens depends on if it's a target, which at the moment is just a player, but it could be any sort of particular thing that isn't a secondary source, like an open door or a knocked over table or whatever. If it is a target, what we actually do is we activate the target Blackboard key, and that will trigger stuff in the behavior tree again, which we've covered before. But if it's an interest source, which is basically anything else, we start the whole discovery process, which I've been through before as well. But the general gist is you have the interest source, which is just the thing in the world, and you have this back and forth where the AI says, I'd like to discover you. Let's open the interest source and have a look. There we go. So it goes, I'd like to discover you. And then there is some back and forth here where basically the source itself will check that another AI hasn't already done that, check that it's not too late, as in roles have already been assigned, goes through all that stuff. But basically there's a back and forth, and if the AI is allowed to discover it, then we can progress a bit further. And we do, this is the main new bit I've been working on since Tuesday, is so if you reach this stage, what we can determine is that there's something in the world that the AI has discovered and is aware of, and now it needs to decide if that's more important than what it's already doing. So this is what the whole interest source thing is when it comes to the, sorry, let's get to the new behavior tree. So that's what sets all of these keys here, the actual object, the sense, the type, the priority, and also when it was discovered. And that also basically drives this whole part of the tree where it will only go down here if it's got an interest, basically, and then we'll filter based on that. So to start with, how this worked was pretty simple, right? It just said, hey, are you a higher priority? Yes, no. And if you are, I'm going to change. And if you're not, I'm going to stick. And if you're the same, I'm still going to stick because I hadn't made it do the right stuff. But now it does. Now it's a bit more complicated. Hopefully, well, it's not too complicated, but it's more complicated. First thing to point out, something that is amazing, and I don't know why I didn't think of this being the obvious solution to it. I always just thought it was strange we got on with it. A new 4.16 feature is if you've got inputs for your functions. Previously, what I always ended up doing is making these local variables like straight off the bat, so I could reference them later. Excuse me. Now you can just get them just like anything else, which is cool because you don't end up with messy wires everywhere, and you don't have to make a bunch of local variables you don't actually need. Anyway, so what this takes is it says this is the new interest source that I've just seen, and this is the sense that I perceived it with. I'd love to roll those together, but I can't quite decide how. Now, I also wrote some other little helper things, and again, I might do this another way, but this seems to tidy things up. I was getting frustrated that I was basically having to set all of these keys often, and this is obviously the kind of situation where you probably want a struct or something, but from a little bit of research, it seems that structs aren't supported in the way that I'd want on the Blackboard. So instead, I set them all, but how I do that is I made a bunch of like get and set helpers here. So for example, this one, to get the current record, it's just using the normal stuff. It gets the Blackboard, gets all the different keys, shoves them into this struct that I have made here, an interest record, and then returns it. And as you would expect, so you can see here, there you go. So I get the current one and I set to the current record. And then this one, I take the new interest source that came in as this argument to the filter, and I make another interest record. And so I set those up for comparison, right? And now I have the two, and I can just pick the things I want. So as I said, the way this is going to work, and as I said before, I think this is all basically, well, there's some interpretation, but it is very heavily influenced by the way that Mark of the Ninja supposedly does it. It's in one of the Game AI Pro books. I recommend checking it out. It's really, really useful. But I start with the priority, right? This is a priority that we'll assign to them and we'll figure out over time. Let's say like a door being opened is like 2 or 3 and a dead body is 10, right? So there's lots of options there. So the quickest and cheapest one to compare, right, is to compare these 2 ints and go, are these the same? And if they're not, great, they kind of makes life easier, because then you go, well, is one greater than the other one? And basically, if the new one is greater than the old one, then you change it, and that triggers an event we'll come to shortly, or we stick with the one we've already got. Now, the other path is slightly more complicated, and I haven't tested this yet, but I hope this will work. The idea is that you go, okay, well, if they are the same, then I need to check if a few other things are the same. So if the priority is the same, and it was the same sense, and it was the same type, you're kind of being, the potential is you're kind of being spammed with them is the idea. The most obvious example of this would be footstep sounds. Player footstep sounds will be interest sources, right? So it's just going to be firing off a bunch of those, but they're all quite close to each other. So if it changes interest source every time that happened, it's going to be a bit weird. So in this situation, let's pretend that's what's happened, right? So it would be the same priority, it would be the same sense, and it would be the same type. So if that's the case, I go, well, how close is this to the last one? And if it's quite close, just ignore it, right? But if it's not that close, change to it. So you can, again, I know this will need some fine tuning, but in my head I can see that it goes, okay, let's say 3 footsteps, they're all quite close together, so it's just going to move to the first point. But beyond that, it's far enough away that it's going to change. So I think that will kind of smooth it out. I know it's not going to work perfectly first time. Nothing ever does. Anyway, but so that's the distance check. And then if that's not the case, so basically if it's not all the same, but the priorities are the same, then I just say, well, which one did you discover most recently? And if that's the new one, then say it's the new one. And if that's the old one, then just stick with what you got. So that's kind of smooth things out a lot. Between that and the thing of 416 about that means I don't have to just put in loads of like local variables to control these things. It all looks a lot cleaner. I'm trying to think. There's not too much today, because between all the 416 stuff and sort of porting all this back over from my own build, it's not been too many changes. But let's think. So I covered all of that stuff. Which was good. Did I change anything else in the patrol? I have a feeling I changed a little something. Could be lying. Have a quick look in here. I know I did smooth out some stuff in here. But you know what? It's pretty minor. I remember the only thing I've done here since earlier on is that I actually have a thing in the construction script that handles them being parented to each other. This is something I really need to look into, because I don't know. It's one of these things, I've never made tools before, and now it's time to kind of make something which I guess I consider to be a design tool, in that the proper relationship between this object and these this patrol objects, or the master, and these nodes, it's not a real thing. Like, what I'd love is I click one and it selects all of them and they're aware of each other and there's debug and stuff. But for now, you know, they're only associated by this array containing a list, this array containing these other values. But we'll get there. So I guess the next thing to move on to briefly is kind of what's left. And for that, I'm just going to have a super sneaky look at my list. Oh yes, of course. So the main thing that I'm creeping towards by doing all this filtering and everything like that is, let's go back over here, is the last known position I talked about before. And the aim was that I was going to do the last known position stuff by making it an interest source, right? Rather than having some, I don't want to say hacky, because it was a fairly defined system I had before, but rather than having some new bespoke thing, I realized that hopefully this concept of last known position is basically just kind of a only very slightly specialized interest source. So how I'm handling that is we've got our big perception updated thing, which kind of drives everything. And what we do is only on site, because you don't, well, there is a concept of last heard position, obviously, but that's kind of more straightforward, because obviously a sound is literally just a one-off event and it just happens. Like you don't start sensing it, you don't start sensing the sound and stop sensing it. You just know that it happened and it stays there, right? But for covering sight, what we do is, yes, here we go. So I look at it and go, if this is a target, i.e. it's the player for the time being, what do I do with it? So I've got this process LKP thing, and this is very work in progress, which is kind of what led to me doing all the other stuff, which has helped. So I do the normal thing of going, okay, well, if you just stopped sensing this thing, then it's time to place this last known position. So as in if it was tracking the player, they've disappeared off the cone, right, at that point, that's where this object needs to go. That's where this specialized version of the interest source needs to go. So I do the normal thing here. I go, did it exist already? If it didn't, make it. If it does, move it. Straightforward. And then only if I have some suspicion, so suspicion level above 0, I think specifically 1, I can't remember why, but basically only if it's got enough interest to care, then what we do is we set the last known position as the interest. So because I made this interest record struct, I can just build that right here and go, boom, that's what I want. And because I made this thing to set the blackboard, I can just fire that in there. And for the time being, I suspect I'll need to do a bit more here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to a really high priority, so it should kick anything else out of there. I suspect these will need fine-tuning forever, because I think in most situations it's going to want to move to that last known position, because the last known position of the target is probably the most important thing, but we'll see. But for now, it's just going to be, and that's what's going to happen. So it's going to set that record. It's basically like skipping that whole discovery process I said before, because it's just going to directly inject this interest into the AI's brain, which I kind of like the idea of. It's a kind of sort of light director type thing, in that the AI is fairly autonomous and itself doesn't cheat, but something from a higher level can go, just do what I say. This is the correct thing to do. And crucially, being able to build and inject these is something I think the other designers will want to do. For scripting stuff, for example, I had some horrific hack to light torches. I don't even want to talk about how it worked, but now that could be an interest source. That could be a record that could be generated that says for some reason you're really interested in changing the state of this torch. And the cool thing is, as they're walking over to that, if something else more interesting happens, they'll automatically switch with what I've made. Whereas if it was some kind of more hard-coded scripting thing like I had before, nothing will change it, and that looks really artificial and weird. So that's that. That's the kind of thing where that's all kind of blending in. The sort of blend between patrolling. Let's go to the thing. Why not? Basically, it's getting to the point where I can blend between chasing the player, losing them, and then chasing after them as part of an investigation, which is its own role, and then either killing them or not killing them and giving up, and then that falls back to patrolling. And then basically the hope is that you'd never end up here. This is the kind of, oh dear, something bad happened, I'll stand around forever. So I think that's everything. I'm looking at my to-do list, what's coming up. So I got to finish off this last known position stuff. It's nearly there, but it's not quite. Maybe another day or two on that. And I've still got the target behavior stuff, which we covered a little bit of. That's mostly working, but again, it's the kind of the interplay between the two needs a lot of fine tuning, so they're still ongoing. Not even started yet. Let's have a look. Is actually quite obvious stuff, right? Debug. Just need loads of debug. I don't really know how to do it all properly. I know how to do bits and pieces, but I want to spend some time researching how to do these things properly, because I need stuff like the thing that's running this patrol should say who's associated with it, which point they're at, what they're doing. You know, we can have some little lines going to each one, and maybe a line attaching to the AI. And likewise for the interest sources, they should say who they're attached to, what roles have been assigned, lots of just text and stuff like that. Things that I should have but don't yet. And I've got a few kind of if I get time things, which I might manage to do. Stuff where I wanted to add more sort of smart object-like concepts, like basically moving out of this abstract, ridiculous world that I live in. And if we pretend that there was some object, it's funny, we don't have these, but I just can't think of anything right now. You know, like a set of drawers or something. So instead of them Because at the moment they'll know that it's an interest source and they know that they can walk over and investigate it. But what they don't know yet is they should be able to say, okay, interest source, who is the instigator? Who created you? Right. And now I'm going to look at you. And do you have any animations I can play in a specific place for you? So they will, right? Like my favorite Fallout 2 animation of interacting with any object like that. They should at least do something like that. And then they can complete the investigation as they do already. That's one thing. So that's kind of, I'm calling that like a search node. And then I think the only other thing left for this milestone for me is to have a little think about the concept of trespass. So I'm sure that's a thing you're familiar with. I'm sure if you're more into sort of, immersive sim type stuff, and the idea that it's an area that maybe at some point in the game you're allowed to go into, and AI don't mind you being there. They just ignore you. But maybe your status changes with that faction or something else occurs and certain areas are now restricted. My presumption is that you probably do that with the nav mesh somehow, but I don't know. So I'm going to find out. And I think basically that will about do it. Sorry, it's a bit shorter this evening. As I said, it's been a lot of sort of merging everything back together with 4.16 and trying not to sweat to death because I'm English, and as soon as it gets warm, I complain about wanting to be warm all year, and then it gets warm and I'm slightly upset. Anyway, I hope that was very useful. I'll be back next Tuesday. That will hopefully be more focused stream. Please send any questions or anything. I'm always looking for things to try and cover, and the team will be very pleased that I'm not just bugging them about it all the time. Please check out our website, stevensandfox.com, and we're on all the usual forums and Twitter and all the rest of it. Please do reach out. I'd love to cover stuff that you're actually interested in seeing rather than me having to make it up all the time. But until next time, thanks very much for watching. See you later. Bye.